All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear. Welcome to the CMC. It's an honor to be here on the CMC's 25th birthday. WGOT is celebrating its 10th year on the air. And we couldn't have done it without you. And there are some other people I'd like to thank at this time as well. I wanted to thank the founders and previous managers of this radio station, because we wouldn't be where we are now without them. And that includes Sheila Bishop, Bill Bryson, Barry Sawicki, Adam Reinhard, Steve Schell, and Lynn Lowenthal. We wouldn't be where we are now without them. There are too many volunteers to thank. We have about 50 volunteers doing programs of all shapes and forms. But there's been just a core of people that have been there through thick and thin, and I'd like to recognize those at this time too. Chris Lake, Debbie Martinez, Doug Clifford, who's there in the back with his daughter, and Victor Perez, our head of programming for the Spanish language programming we offer, as well as one of our newer volunteers, Luke Tia. Thank you for being here as well. Just a little background on WGOT. We started off as 1/3 of a radio station. We shared the 94.7 frequency that Howard mentioned earlier. We shared that with 2 churches. Believe it or not, we did. And we had no drive time. We weren't on in the morning or afternoon. So something had to happen. And a year and a half ago it did. On our 9th anniversary, in January of 2017, we began broadcasting at 100.1 FM, 24 hours a day. And we haven't looked back. We've continued growing, and we hope big things are coming. We've finished our studio at the Civic Media Center. We invite you to come by. We invite you to volunteer. You can go to WGOT.org and submit a program proposal for you to have your own show. We would love to have you. And last, to echo Howard's sentiments, we would love to have sustaining members and one-time donors to WGOT as well. You can go to the website to find out more. We have a Patreon account where you can be a sustaining member for as little as $1 a month. So we invite you to go check that out. And also a GoFundMe, which is currently a fund established for us to resume streaming worldwide, hopefully by the end of the year. And all of you here will help make that happen, I'm sure. So I wanted to say thank you for all of that. There's a lot of things going on this weekend, and to see a crowd like this is phenomenal to me. So thank you all for being here. And in conclusion, I had no idea that I was going to have this honor, but it is a great honor to introduce all the way from New York City, Democracy Now! Host, Amy Goodman.
I won't be able to see you guys if I don't do this. Yeah. Wow, it's wonderful to be here to celebrate CMC, to celebrate Gainesville's other transmitter, WGOT. And to be in Florida right now at this absolutely pivotal time. If some people want to come and sit here on the floor, feel free, that are standing at the back. And there is a chair or two here, so some folks could find that. But it is such an important time now to have community media, how important it is to have corporate-free radio. You know, I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949 by a war resister named Lou Hill, who came out of the detention camps after World War II in California and said there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. Not run by corporations, as George Gerbner would say, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. And so KPFA was born in Berkeley, California, 49. KPFK in Los Angeles, 1959. My station, WBAI in New York in 1960. WPFW in Washington, and it's great to see Faye Williams here, who for so many years had a bookstore in Washington, D.C. called Sister Space. But she had to come back home to Gainesville in 2012 to, I guess, get rid of old Joe. She felt that was very, very important to put old Joe in his place in the cemetery. It's that kind of daily activism that makes this country great. That's the kind of activism that makes this country great again. Now, guys, there are 2 more seats over here if you want to sit there. So WPFW in Washington, 1977, and KPFT, the station in Houston, Texas, went on the air in the spring of 1970. It's celebrating 48 years now. And KPFT went on the air, and within a few weeks, it was blown up. The Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. It was right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, which I thought that was a good song, but... So they get back on their feet, they rebuild the transmitter. A few weeks later, they're back on the air. And the Klan straps 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blows it up again. So now it takes months to get back on the air. And in January of 1971, with the national media there, Arlo Guthrie came back into Houston to finish his song live on the air. And KPFT has been going ever since. Now, I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is, how dangerous WGOT is and CMC is, Democracy Now! Dangerous to those who would silence the voices of, I won't say a fringe minority, because I really do think that those who care about war and peace, those who care about economic, racial, and social justice, those who care about climate change, the fate of the planet, as you well know here in Florida, those who care about the growing inequality in this country, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take the media back. That's what the Klan was so threatened by. Hearing people speaking for themselves. And that's what you've got when you've got WGOT. I mean, we're just driving in here to Gainesville, and we turn on the radio. I'm listening to Medea Benjamin give a speech about Saudi Arabia that was a year ago. How relevant today. Yeah, a woman who has co-founded Code Pink has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and her activism just never stops. I saw her last week because I went down to place Faye knows well, Busboys and Poets, which is a local watering hole, restaurant, and gathering space, a few of them in Washington, D.C. And I was there for a public interview last Thursday, interviewed Angela Davis, and Medea had come out. But think about what happens when you hear someone speaking from their own experience. Whether it is a Palestinian child or a Canadian-Palestinian emergency room doc who came from Canada to Gaza to help the people of Gaza in the midst of the great walk of return that they have been having, the March of Return since March 30th. Israeli military has killed, I believe, more than 170 people, shot more than 5,000 in this period. I'm getting my numbers actually from Haggai Aled, who is the executive director of B'Tselem, an Israeli peace or human rights organization, who is just on Democracy Now! Today, because he testified for the first time officially invited by the UN Security Council. And he described how the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, addressed him when he spoke about his deep concerns about how Palestinians are treated. And the Israeli ambassador said, how they encourage democracy in English, what the people at the UN could understand. And then in Hebrew, still over the same mic, he said to him, "You traitor, you traitor." But you hear people describing their own experience, whether it's an Afghan grandmother or an elder from Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota. And that changes you. I didn't say you have to agree with what you hear. I mean, how often do you even agree with your family members, right? But you begin to understand where someone is coming from. It's that understanding that's the beginning of peace. It makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy someone. It's that understanding that's the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why it's so important that you've got WGOT. So, the news headlines are just pouring in today. Just in the last 24 hours, President Trump has acknowledged that the Washington Post columnist, Jamal Khashoggi, was probably murdered. President Trump came to that conclusion in the last few hours. This is after weeks. October 2nd, Khashoggi goes into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. Actually, before that, a few weeks before that, he went into the Saudi embassy in Washington. He lives in the D.C. area. He's a U.S. resident, has American-born children, has been there for many years, writes for the Washington Post, and he wanted to get some papers for his imminent marriage to his Turkish fiancée. And they told him he had to go to Turkey. She's Turkish. He had to go to the Saudi consulate in Turkey. So he goes there to Istanbul, and he walks in, and it was at the end of September, and he said, "I'd like to get these documents." And they said, "Come back in a week's time." October 2nd, I think it was like 1:30 in the afternoon. So he goes to London, he participates in a conference, and he comes back. That seems to give them, Saudi Arabia, the time they want. Because a few hours before he enters the consulate with his fiancée standing outside, 2 Saudi jets fly in to Istanbul. And they apparently, reportedly, carry 15 men, a hit squad. And they're made up of the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman's security team, a leading forensic doctor who deals with fast mobile autopsies, who brings in a bone saw, and they make their way into the consulate. And that's when Jamel walks in, his partner outside, and she never sees him again. Apparently, it all went down very quickly. And the video that we have seen is him walking in. Immediately, Saudi Arabia said he went right out. So they started off by flat out lying. But President Trump said, we are going to give them time to come up with their story. We're going to give them time. And then Secretary of State Pompeo goes to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, last Tuesday. You would think that they would call in the Saudi ambassador to Washington, but instead, the United States goes to Riyadh, and you see the pictures of him laughing and smiling with the king and the crown prince. And then we later learned that soon after, Saudi Arabia wires the United States $100 million, or however you send that money. And maybe that's why Pompeo is smiling in that way. President Trump says, first, it's about weapons sales. But he won't admit that this reporter was murdered. He says, we're waiting for the investigation. The investigation by whom? By the country accused of committing the murder? I think about how Donald Trump never waits when it comes to jumping to conclusions, and that has been going on for decades. I'm thinking about the Central Park Five in New York. There's a group of 5 young men, African-American boys, who are rounded up one night because of a horrific crime that was committed, the rape of a jogger in Central Park. They round them up. They're boys who live right above Central Park in Harlem. And they're arrested. The term the media coins is the wolf pack, referring to them as animals. They're ultimately convicted. Now, there was DNA, and it didn't match any of them, but that was just put aside. And they served many, many years in jail. Donald Trump helped to lead the charge of hate against them, this developer in New York. He took out full-page ads in the New York Times calling for them to be given the death penalty. So they serve years in jail. All of them serve their full time. I came to know their mothers. Oh my gosh, they never stopped organizing for their sons. One of them, Sharon Salam, would come into WBAI in New York, and there's a line from the movie Hurricane, you know, if hate got them in there, love would bust them out. And that's why I knew someday her son Yusuf Salam was going to get out. She was so determined to get him out. So they served their time in prison. And it's interesting, I lived not so far away from them, and one day a woman in my building was raped, and she ran downstairs, and because she did, she really saved her own life. And the doorman of the building jumped the man who came running out of her apartment. His name was Matthias Reis. And how this connects to this is that as the young men were serving time in jail, one of the last ones in prison was walking one day in the prison, and this guy comes up to him and says, you know, I know you're really mad at me. I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. And he doesn't even know who he is. And he says, I know what you're talking about. He says, I'm sorry. I know you're mad. I know you're mad. He says, what are you talking about? I don't even know who you are. And he says, Matthias Race, I did it. And he says, what? And he says, yeah, I'm the one who did it. So Matthias Race was jailed because this young woman came out of her apartment screaming and saved her own life, and he was caught for raping her. Actually, at that period of time, this was his MO. He would kill or rape, and he would particularly go after the eyes of the women. It was all around the north part of Central Park. So the police even had someone to look for, because this was happening over and over. But because of their racism and because they had their mindset, they looked for no one else but some boys who were in Central Park that night. They could have saved so many if they had not been blinded by bigotry, if our city had not been blinded by bigotry. So the young man, one of the Central Park Five, called his lawyer. Said, I don't know what's going on, but this guy came up to me and apologized and said I must be mad at him. I'm sure he's crazy, but maybe you should investigate this. And they did. And in fact, it was Matthias Race. And yes, the DNA did match. Okay, so that's the story of the Central Park Five. Yusuf got out of prison, and he went on to become a hospital administrator. He has 4 or 5 daughters now. I was on a number of panels with him. William Kunstler's daughters made a wonderful film about their father, and they talked about the Central Park Five. So that's the story. The case was solved. It wasn't the Central Park Five. Donald Trump would never accept this fact. Facts are not his forte. Not so long ago, the city settled for something like $41 or $51 million that went to the Central Park Five for stealing so many years of their life. But Donald Trump, to this day, says they are guilty. So here is a man who, to say the least, jumps quickly to conclusions. But when it comes to what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, who, by the way, right after Donald Trump was elected president, it was November 10th, 2016, right after the election, Khashoggi gave a speech at some think tank in Washington and criticized Donald Trump. He was banned then from Saudi Arabia. So their relationship goes way back, both what he had to say about Donald Trump and how Saudi Arabia protected Donald Trump. And now, Khashoggi is not your typical dissident. He really wasn't a dissident in Saudi Arabia. He, to the end, supported the monarchy. He wasn't calling for elections. People who were dissidents did not think of him as part of their community, but he became increasingly critical of the Saudi regime, and he raised many questions. He was like the loyal opposition, sort of like Schumer walking into the White House and being dismembered, right? It's a horrible image. What we're talking about here. But what took place in that consulate is so horrifying. He was critical of certain aspects and increasingly critical of especially the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And that mattered to them because he was in a huge PR campaign in the United States. Thomas Friedman did this glowing column on him in the New York Times. I think the Times got more comment on that than on almost anything they did. They had to shut down the commentary, the anger of people saying, how dare you laud this man? This was many months ago. But he was on this huge campaign tour in the United States with all his PR firms, and they didn't like someone embedded in both the Saudi establishment and the Washington, D.C. establishment who was raising questions. So he goes into a very official place, right, a consulate, and he disappears. And according to Turkish sources, he was very quickly killed, perhaps dismembered while he was still alive. They say they have audio recordings of what took place, the horror. So among the people we interviewed was Jamel Ashail of Al Jazeera, standing right outside the consulate the other day. And you can go to the Democracy Now! Website and you can see all of our coverage. And he was there just a few days ago when the Saudi regime said they'd allow in the Turkish investigators. And just before they came in, they had a cleaning crew go in, in broad daylight, carrying their bleach and other cleaning products to prepare for the investigators. I mean, what can be more obvious here? I mean, the message is being very clearly sent. You do not dissent. And so we had Sarah Aziza on. She had just come from Saudi Arabia. She writes for The Intercept, and she talked about what happened when the Crown Prince announced that women could drive. Now, that was definitely a good thing, right? That women would be able to drive. It sounds trivial, but obviously in no way it is, the fact that they couldn't drive, but what it means for liberation in a person's life and all that underlay this, why they couldn't drive. And when he announced this, you'd think he would want to have all the praise of all the women who'd been fighting for so many decades, but the women in Saudi Arabia were called one by one, the women activists, and told, you don't say anything when this is announced. Now, they were going to praise him, right? The Crown Prince for moving their country forward, moving it into the 19th century. But they were forbidden. And one of these activists couldn't contain herself. They said they aren't to speak about it, they aren't to write about it, to tweet about it. And finally she wrote, Alhamdulillah, like thanks be to God. That's all she wrote in a tweet. I mean, this is praising the Crown Prince, and she was immediately arrested. And so many of the activists who fought for this were arrested. One woman, activist in Saudi Arabia right now, faces a trial next week and possible death. It is not just Khashoggi, but we know his name, and there's nothing more powerful than knowing a name and being able to identify a person, unlike what has happened in Yemen. As a result of the U.S.-backed Saudi, United Arab Emirates coalition that has been bombing this country to pieces. We hear that Jamal Khashoggi was cut up into pieces, and I think of the little children in Yemen who were blown to pieces month after month. The UN calls Yemen the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in the world. The country, in the last months, a school bus of schoolboys blown up, 51 people killed, 40 of them school children. And that was just weeks ago. And this is happening over and over. Well over 10,000 people have been killed. 1 million people in Yemen have cholera, and that knows no borders. You can contain it in one place. And why is that? Why do they have cholera? Because they bombed the infrastructure of the country back to the Stone Ages. No hospital, no clean water. This is a catastrophe. It is so important to cover what is so important, and we go beyond our borders and we hear the voices of people from all over the world because our country has such an effect on them. Years ago, I was interviewing a woman from Guyana. It was right before the U.S. elections, the presidential elections. So in the music break, we move out one set of guests, we bring in the next set of guests. We have to do this very fast because it's just like 60 seconds. And I'm saying, thanks so much. It was really interesting talking to you. She was with, I think it was called the Red Thread Collective. And they said, thank you so much. And she wouldn't get up. And I said, our segment is done. And we're moving on to a segment on the U.S. election. She said, yes, and I will be a guest on that segment. And I said, well, I'm confused. Are you actually from the United States and you live in Guyana now? She said, no, I'm Guyanese. I'm from Guyana. I said, so why are you going to be a guest on the section on the U.S. elections? And she said, the president of the United States determines politics all over the world. I'll be a guest on this segment. And that is so important to understand. I just interviewed a woman from Hungary yesterday who won the Bill Zabel Award for Human Rights. Hungary, that is an extremely right-wing prime minister. And I asked her, what difference does it make who our president is? And she said, it makes all of the difference. You set the example. And I was interviewing Michael Moore just a few weeks ago for his documentary, Fahrenheit 11/9, and I encourage everyone to see it, right? Transposing 9/11 with 11/9, the day that Donald Trump actually won the election, the day after Election Day. And many of you may have seen this documentary. In the last part, it follows Donald Trump and follows Adolf Hitler. And I asked him about that and, the criticism people have of making comparisons. He said, I actually am not as interested in that, he said, as interested in looking at the one leader, whether it is Adolf Hitler in Germany or President Trump in the United States. He said, I'm more interested in looking at the people of these countries. He said, the good Germans in that case, and who enables this in the United States. And it may be because you support his policies, like the separation of children at the border, like waiting for the Saudis to investigate themselves when it comes to this horrific, sadistic murder. Or it may be you absolutely oppose it, but the question is, what do you do about it? And he said, I'm interested in looking at all of that. But how interesting it is to just hear all of these voices. But I started with Khashoggi in Turkey, murdered there. And by the way, just as I was coming up on the stage tonight, I saw the latest news. Saudi Arabia, following President Trump and Secretary of State Pompeo, has admitted that Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate. They said it was a result of a fight. They said he came in and a fight ensued. You may have also heard, we read a report on the show today, that one of the 15 men who went into the consulate, then quickly left in 2 planes, one going through Egypt, not clear, what this is all about. And Turkish officials are combing a forest nearby in Turkey for his body parts. But one of the men who was believed to be in that 15-man hit squad just died in a car accident in Riyadh. So I don't know if when President Trump said, we're just waiting for the Saudis to get back in touch with us, whether this is the kind of thing that they're waiting for. Clearly, they want the attention off of the crown prince. I was listening to all sorts of commentary on the crown prince and his relationship with Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor. Some talk about the crown prince and the clown prince. But if only we could just laugh about it. Jared Kushner being praised by Nikki Haley as she goes out as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, saying he is a true genius as he shapes a Middle East peace plan, which he considers Mohammed bin Salman a key part of. It's really important to understand the relationship of the Trumps to Saudi Arabia, and that has to be further investigated. I'll just start with what President Trump has said himself, for example, in 2015 when he was running for president, talking about how he likes the Saudis because they've given him tens of millions of dollars. This is not weapons sales and jobs to the United States. He was talking about the Trump empire and what Saudis, I think he said the term $40 to $50 million, he was saying in 2015. This has to be investigated. It's very difficult from both ends because the Trump family will not release their tax returns. And of course, Saudi Arabia is an authoritarian regime, and so it's very hard to track the money. But I think that's the attraction between the two. And this is a matter of life and death. It is also a matter of oil politics, why the Saudi regime is so close to the United States and vice versa. And so I want to move from Saudi Arabia and the United States relationship to the heart of the United States. I want to go north to North Dakota, to the standoff at Standing Rock. Indigenous people, Native American people in this country fighting for all of us to have a sustainable future, to have a future at all. You know, Democracy Now! Went to North Dakota Labor Day weekend in that presidential election year of 2016. But it started well before that. We got to it late, actually. We were reporting on it early, but we weren't actually there on the ground till Labor Day. It was April 1st, 2016, that the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, decided to open her property to the resistance. The resistance? Well, the resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline, what the Native Americans call the Black Snake. The plan at the time was that the Dakota Access Pipeline, known as DAPL, would take the fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, and then hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Standing Rock Sioux of North Dakota said no. Now, they weren't really different from other North Dakotans. The people of Bismarck, the capital of North Dakota, they said no, and their views were respected. The people of Mandan, where the prison is, where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Native Americans have been imprisoned for fighting Dakota Access Pipeline, the people of Mandan said no, and their views were respected. So the Standing Rock Sioux, they just also said no. They didn't want it near their property, and they're particularly concerned about the pipeline going underneath the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, saying it imperils the water supply of 17 million people downstream. And they're not just Native. They're non-Native as well, and they were doing it for everyone. And they said no. Now, this was during the Obama years, and President Obama was allowing this to take place, but it was moving along slowly, and the people were gathering steam. And LaDonna Brave Bull Allard said, come to my property along the Cannonball River. You can set up camp, your teepees, your tents. And she thought a couple dozen people would come. So scores of people came, then hundreds of people came, then thousands of people came. Many resistance camps were set up, like the Red Warrior Camp. Her camp, I think, was the Sacred Stone Camp, and others. Native and non-Native. I mean, it was the largest gathering of Native tribes and First Nations this country has seen in decades, from Latin America, from the United States, the First Nations of Canada as well. And this was all building steam during the presidential election, okay? The presidential election year. And yet, in the main election debates, the media personalities, don't really call them journalists, but the media personalities who officiated over these debates, they did not ask one question about climate change, let alone the standoff at Standing Rock. Now, I was invited on a panel that was moderated by Bill Schieffer. Bill Schieffer just recently retired from CBS, you know, one of the leading news anchors in the United States. And I said, you know, why didn't you all raise the issue of climate change? And he said, okay, in that case, I do think we got it wrong. And that's really important. But I do think it's really absolutely critical to understand this is not just about Fox. We know, you know, they're the official, well, they're the unofficial state media. If we had state media, how would it be any different, right? That's Fox. But I'm talking about MSNBC and CNN. Think about Hurricane Michael, okay? Think about Hurricane Maria before that. I mean, with Michael, and you all were, really at the heart of it here, it was 24 hours a day, maybe 23 hours a day on the networks. And actually, as it should be, it was absolutely terrifying. And all the details of what could happen, there was nonstop coverage. Almost never. I mean, extreme weather, severe weather was flashing across the screen, as it should be. But almost never did you see those words climate change or global warming or global climate disruption. Never. They spent all of this time detailing everything but that. And why does it matter? Because there is something we can do about it. I mean, we don't have a choice. In the last 2 weeks, the UN just came out with that report. This is the Nobel Peace Prize winning IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, thousands of scientists. You heard President Trump was just asked about whether he believes, right? He, for so long, has called it a Chinese hoax. If only. And now asked by both AP and asked by Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes, do you believe in climate change? And AP, think he said his uncle was a professor at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a very, very smart man. And he said, I believe in science. But he cannot bring himself to say that he believes in climate change. And why does this matter? It's not just a matter of his belief. It's that these beliefs are put into action. And this is a matter of the fate of the planet. It does matter. I mean, for all the chaos of the administration, the EPA is rolling back environmental protections at a speed that we have never seen before. Sure, Scott Pruitt was finally driven out because he's got that infection that so many in the administration does of just outright corruption. But he's replaced by Andrew Wheeler, who's a former coal lobbyist who just works ever more efficiently in rolling back regulations that protect the air and the water and the land that we live on. It really, really matters. But that's what the people of Standing Rock had been saying all through the year they were fighting the pipeline. So months later, on Labor Day weekend, Democracy Now! Went to cover on the ground the struggle over DAPL. And what we found was amazing. We arrived on a Friday and we're covering these protests. And I mean, these are the rural back roads of North Dakota. You'd have the elders, especially the women in traditional garb, and they'd start with a water ceremony. They'd have glasses of water and pitchers of water on the road, and they would hold it up and they would begin to walk, and they would be met by a fully militarized sheriff's department. These are their neighbors. I mean, the sheriff's department had MRAPs, had tanks, had tear gas, had drones, had automatic weapons, and they're bringing them glasses of water. They're saying, this is for you, not just for us. This is for your children, not just for ours. Now, you know that scene because you saw it in Ferguson, right? You saw it a few years ago when a white police officer gunned down Michael Brown, August 9th. Hot August sun, his body, his corpse lay baking in the sun hour after hour after hour after hour, more than 4 hours. And there's just a people's uprising of horror. And they're met by all of these police departments, the local St. Louis and suburban police departments that are fully militarized. This is recycling in America today. You take the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan, and you give them to the police departments of the United States. Some of the most eloquent opponents of the militarization of American police are former police chiefs. People like Norm Stamper. He was the former police chief of Seattle, Washington. I remember him from the Battle of Seattle, 1999, people rising up against the World Trade Organization that was meeting there. Remember, it was the Clinton years. Madeleine Albright couldn't get out of her hotel room because of the tear gas. I mean, the Seattle Police Department had a veritable riot. They used so much tear gas against the teachers, the environmentalists, the union activists, the high school kids. I mean, farmers who had come in from all over, doctors, nurses, librarians, thousands of people. They used so much tear gas against them, they had to go to nearby states to get more. And as a result of this police attack on civil society, Norm Stamper was driven out, as he should have been, the police chief. But he would later say it was the worst mistake of his life. Juan Gonzalez and I interviewed him not so long ago in New York studios. And he said, we just made a terrible, terrible miscalculation, he said. Not that we miscalculated how much tear gas we needed. No, he didn't say that. He said that when you start to look at your community through a barrel of a gun, through the crosshairs, you forget they're not the enemy. We forget that they were our teachers, our kids, our labor leaders. We forgot this. And that's why it is so dangerous. We have to celebrate civil society. Dissent is what will save us, which is why it's so critical. Why it's so critical we have radio stations like WGOT. It's the way we have a communal conversation beyond our own kitchen table. So back to Standing Rock. That weekend we arrived on Friday. We're covering these protests. Saturday we heard there was going to be this tribal ceremony. Native American tribes were going to gather in this place where they said was their sacred burial ground. And they were going to plant their flags. It was Labor Day weekend, Saturday, so they didn't think that the bulldozers would be there. But when they got there, they saw the bulldozers operating at full tilt. They were completely shocked. Sorry, I don't just eat candy in the middle of a talk, but... maybe I'll have a little more. But if someone would just test it before you give it to me. Okay. But, so we go over, and these massive bulldozers are excavating this area that, as I said, they had said was their sacred burial ground. And this is really important. A judge was going to rule the following Friday. And he had said to the Standing Rock Sioux, okay, if you say this is your burial ground, you prove it to me, you draw me a map. And so they did. And they drew this map. They designated what the area was. Thank you. No, I appreciate the thought. And the judge, as judges do, gave it to Energy Transfer Partners. They own the Dakota Access Pipeline because the judges give it to the other side. And the Native Americans really felt that Dakota Access Pipeline used this map, brought the bulldozers from afar to this place, based on their map, to destroy this area before the judge ruled, so the facts on the ground would be changed. It would be a moot point. And they were furious. So the bulldozers are going at full tilt, and older women with little girls and men and boys, well, first the women and the girls came onto the property, and they stood in front of the bulldozers, and I can't express how terrifying this was and how dangerous it was. I mean, these are massive earth-crushing machines. And we were filming nonstop. I want to say that my colleague Dennis Moynihan is here, who co-writes the books that we do together. And we'll be signing books afterwards. We'll figure out a makeshift way to do it right here. John Hamilton, our videographer, and Laura Gottesdiener. We were there on the ground, so we were just filming. And as I saw the women and girls standing in front of the bulldozer, I thought back to, right before the Iraq War, right? That was March 19th, 2003. March 16th, In another part of the Middle East, in Gaza, an American student named Rachel Corey from Olympia, Washington, Evergreen College, went to try to do her part for peace in the Middle East. And she'd befriended a Palestinian pharmacist family in Gaza, in Rafah. And an Israeli military bulldozer made by Caterpillar here in the United States was pulling up to demolish his house. And she and other activists from the International Solidarity Movement lined up, and they put on those, like what construction workers wear, those orange fluorescent vests, and they were standing in front of the house. And they were trying to protect it from this bulldozer. And Rachel was crushed to death. And that's what I thought about when I saw these women standing in front of the bulldozer. I mean, so unbelievably brave and terrifying. But this time the bulldozers pulled back, one after another. The first one, the second one, the third one, fourth, fifth, sixth. They're pulling back. The people are moving more quickly. They're moving forward. More and more people are coming from the resistance camps because they're hearing what's happening. And it's then that the dapple guards unleash dogs on the Native Americans. Dogs. I mean, we filmed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. And I am a dog lover. And to see these dogs used as weapons was so horrifying. They would throw them into the crowd, and so the dogs would bite their way out. They also were scared. And this was the scene of chaos. But they very deliberately would sick these dogs on the Native Americans. But still, the Native Americans moved forward. And finally, the guards took their dogs and put them into their pickup trucks and their cars, and the bulldozers pulled back, and the people prevailed that day. Oh, I mean, they were bitten, they were beaten, they were maced, they were tear-gassed, but they prevailed at an unacceptably high price, but they won that day. And we took this videotape, and we posted it online that night. When I'm invited on MSNBC and CNN, I often use the opportunity to talk to the host, say, why don't you talk more about climate change? Not just with me, but on a regular basis. What counts is not, you might even say, no, you're wrong. On one of these networks, I saw a special. And I don't doubt that. But I'm talking about the daily drumbeat of news. It has to be incorporated every day because that is how serious it is. As often as they say the word Trump, they should say the word climate change. So, and I say, why not? And hosts, anchors who are sympathetic say, because the executives say people's eyes glaze over and they care about the eyeballs on us, and we're going to lose viewership. So we post this video online that night. Within 48 hours, there are 14 million views. Any corporate network executive would drool to have those kinds of numbers. It really just showed the lie. People are intensely interested if you show them what's happening. So that night, it was Sunday now, we had to fly back to New York. Of course, we were continuing to cover this, and Friday, the judge was going to rule. On Thursday, the governor of North Dakota at the time was named Governor Dalrymple, and he called out the National Guard on Thursday. It did not look good for the tribe for the decision the next day. Oh, and quietly, the authorities of North Dakota issued an arrest warrant for me. Now, I didn't know this at the time. So on Friday, we do the broadcast. The judge is going to rule in the evening, and then Nermeen Sheikh and I, who co-host Democracy Now! On Thursdays, we were going to Canada. I wasn't fleeing. I didn't know about the arrest warrant, but we were invited to the Toronto International Film Festival to speak after a film about the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. And he said to young journalism students, if you can remember two words, remember governments lie. And if you can remember three words, remember all governments lie. So that's the name of the film. You should all watch it. It's called All Governments Lie. It's the story of the muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. And the first part is about I.F. Stone, and then it's about news organizations that follow in his footsteps, like Democracy Now! So that's why we were there. And I wasn't actually going to go, but we had just been in North Dakota, and people in Canada care about First Nations. So I thought it was really important. We have an eyewitness account, and I have to share it. So I went there that night, and I spoke. That was Friday night. Saturday, we were invited to the University of Toronto. And there were hundreds of people there. It was a crowd like this, maybe a bit more. And so we were each giving speeches, and I gave my speech. And in the middle of my speech, I always have my phone. I get a text. Ding. And I look down, and it says, "You're under arrest." Now, I didn't know what was going on. And I thought, is this some kind of scam? Like someone in the audience has gotten control of my phone, and how do they know my number? But I wasn't saying anything. I was just trying to conduct the speech. And I was looking down, but then I did see that it was a North Dakota number. That didn't look good. It said, "There's an arrest warrant for you." I went, oh. So I thought, okay, I think I know how this works. If there's an arrest warrant for you, but I didn't explain this. I didn't want people to know what was going on. If there's an arrest warrant for you, it's not like you're going to be picked up right away. But if you have interaction with the police, the FBI, or border agents, and it's in the system, you will be taken. Now, I'm in Canada, and I have to go over the border to get home to New York. So I thought if I could beat the arrest warrant going into the system and make it back to New York. So I just looked out, and I said, "Could someone call me a cab?" So I went to the airport, and I made it back to New York before the arrest warrant. And that was good. It didn't help that in those ensuing weeks, it turned out there was an arrest warrant for me. Something unbelievable happened. Our senior producer, now our news director, Mike Burke, was getting married, and it was a big party in Chinatown. That wasn't unbelievable. It was really great. And his whole family was there, and everyone was dancing and everything. This was right after this. And all of a sudden, everyone's phones went off, and there was the Chelsea bombing. That was a bad situation. Democracy Now! Was right near there. And anyway, every day, all the streets were sealed off in this area. I raced back. Democracy Now! Was there. And you have to be escorted no matter where we went in this area by the FBI or the police. And meanwhile, I know I have an arrest warrant, and I have to continually have an FBI agent at my side to get around, and cover the news because Democracy Now! Was right there. But that was just a side story, which I haven't usually shared before. But the bigger point was I knew we had to go back to North Dakota. I knew that this was a warning to all journalists. Do not come to North Dakota, which is why we had to go back. And especially for young journalists, I had to let them know. We had to call their bluff. I mean, the word got out that I was going to be arrested, and I wanted to let young people know, you don't have to get a record when you put things on the record. If you want to go to North Dakota because this epic struggle is taking place, and you think, wait, I can't get arrested and go to jail, I don't have institutional backing, I don't have the support, I want to let them know, no, you can go. We have to keep our society open and free. So we headed back to North Dakota, the same team, Dennis is right over there, and as we were flying into Bismarck on Friday afternoon, we landed, and the authorities quashed the arrest warrant and dropped the charges against me, which is exactly what I thought would happen, except that then they brought more serious charges against me. Felony riot. I am this one-woman riot? What are they talking about? I had no idea what was going on. We just landed at the airport, so I call my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, I mean, what's going to happen? And he said, it's not the worst thing in the world. I said, how much time do I face? And he said, maybe a year in prison. I said, a year? So I said, well, how much time do I have? And he said, 3 days. The arraignment is Monday at 1:30. So I said, good, that gives us 2.5 days to cover the protests. And then So we cover them over the weekend, and then Monday morning, well, the show must go on. You know, Democracy Now! Airs every weekday morning at 8 a.m. New York time. So North Dakota time, that's 7 a.m. So Dennis orders a broadcast truck to be sent up from Minneapolis. And we decide to broadcast in Mandan, with the backdrop being the courthouse and the jail. So I could just turn around and turn myself in. So we set up on a church property across the street. And the courthouse, the jail, and the 10 Commandments in between. So I interview the 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux, Dave Archambault. He is the first one I interview on the show that day. And he comes on the set, 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux. I mean, that's like Donald Trump is the 45th president of the United States. And I said to him, Chairman Archambault, have you ever been arrested? And so he said, yes. I mean, a few months ago, engaged in civil disobedience. We're fighting for the future of the planet. And yes, I was arrested. And I said, and what happened? And he said, I was charged with low-level misdemeanor, and he was going to go to court. But I said, yes. And then what happened to you? He said, I was strip searched. I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. This chairman, the 45th chairman, I mean, could you imagine? I mean, the 45th president of the United States, strip search, put in an orange jumpsuit. I mean, it would match, but... And I interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle. She's the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, one of the first to be arrested in the summer of 2016 because she cared about the health of the kids. And I said, what happened to you? And so I said, what was the charge? She said it was a low-level misdemeanor. So what happened? I was strip searched. I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. I mean, how much humiliation can people take? I was at the airport at one point in Bismarck in one of these trips, and a guy came up to me. I was reading a magazine, and he said, don't think I don't know who you are. So I said, well, who are you? And he said, I was one of the guards on the DAPL site. I said, did you unleash the dogs on the protesters? They don't call themselves protesters. They call themselves water protectors. I said, did you unleash the dogs? And he said, no. There were 3 different security firms that were hired by Energy Transfer Partners, by Dakota Access Pipeline. We were as shocked as you were. He said, you don't think I understand? We massacre these people for centuries, he said. We unleash dogs on them. You don't think I get why they're angry at us? And I always, when I speak at universities, I say to young people, don't assume based on a person's position what their position will be. So we did the show, and there's a lot of pressure now. I should say that we did release a press release that weekend. I asked my lawyer, so what exactly happens in this period before the arraignment? I said, it's a done deal. He said, done deal. So I said, the charges are going to be brought against me. He says, yeah, the judge rubber stamps this weekend. We'll rubber stamp the charges, and then you'll be arraigned. So I said, wait a second. A judge is involved this weekend? He said, it's not like that. Yes, a judge. I said, but I hear judge, I think discretion. The judge can decide. And so he said, no, it's not like that. He said, decide in the jury, in the trial, and everything else, but now it's rubber stamping. They just rubber stamp these charges. So I said, what is the judge's name? And he said, oh my gosh. So we put out the press release, and we said this judge would be making a decision this weekend about whether to bring the charges. That wasn't inaccurate. There was so much press attention. I mean, the New York Times was covering this. It was the homepage of international BBC, Al Jazeera, the Los Angeles Times. Vogue magazine was covering this. And as the minutes ticked down, hundreds of Native Americans came. They were doing ceremonies. They were showing solidarity. I got a call from North Dakota Public Radio, the longtime anchor there, who knew everybody. It's not a very populous state. And he said, the judge isn't going to do it. He can't. He's not going to sign off on these charges. And so that arraignment didn't happen. But it was not only me. The Native Americans who were facing charges that day, a number of them had those charges dropped. This is what happens when the media shines a spotlight in the right direction. This is the kind of reality TV, not the kind he stars in, but this is the kind of reality TV that we all have to support and build that shows the reality of people's lives on the ground. So I want to say that the judge that day that we went off to Toronto did rule against the tribe. But President Obama had been in Laos that week, had done this Asian tour, first sitting president to go to Laos, and the last act was to have a democracy forum for students around Asia to teach them about democracy. And the last person to raise their hand was a young Malaysian student, and she said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? No American journalists had publicly asked President Obama about this. And it took a woman from Malaysia in Laos, learning about democracy from the president, to ask him, what about DAPL? And she might have seen some images online. And he was eloquent about the oppression of Native Americans over the centuries. But he said, when it comes to the Dakota Access Pipeline, I would have to get back to you. So he came back to the United States. It was right before the judge ruled that Friday. And we heard that he reportedly saw the video of the dogs. It wasn't lost on the first African-American president of the United States. You know, when we released that video that night, we had interviewed also that day Winona LaDuke, great indigenous rights activist from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. And she said, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama 1963. We are through. So it was President Obama's Justice Department that prevailed over the tribe. He had waited till the decision came down late Friday afternoon. But within 15 minutes, as those lawyers were about to pop their champagne corks and the tribe was devastated, an unprecedented 3-agency letter from the Interior Department, the Justice Department, and the Army Corps of Engineers was released, so clearly coordinated through the White House, saying they weren't going to move forward at that point on allowing the final certification of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So it was the Justice Department that had fought the tribe, but now with President Obama back, being questioned as this was really coming down to the wire, he said, we are going to investigate whether the Native Americans were adequately consulted and what else has to be done. And a few months later, he said that they would look at either stopping this or rerouting the pipeline. But then President Donald Trump was elected, and it was one of his first acts in office as president of the United States where he announced he was green-lighting the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone XL pipeline, which had been defeated by people years before. President Obama held on to that as well for years, but how many hundreds of people, well over 1,000, got arrested outside the White House, and he finally said no, he was putting a stop to that. And President Obama said yes. President Trump then green-lighted it all, and the Dakota Access Pipeline was built. But while there was that defeat, the people who led that movement have been leading the movement around the world now, indigenous rights activists, for a sustainable future, against pipeline politics. And we are seeing a surge now. We have never seen the number of Native American women who are running for office across this country. I believe it's Minnesota, where whether it's the Republican candidate for lieutenant governor or the Democratic Farm and Labor candidate for lieutenant governor, Both of them are Native American women, so it will be a Native American woman either way. And a congresswoman from New Mexico, clearly Native, will win because the Democrat will win in that district. She is Native American, and this is happening around the country. But at the same time, you have the court's ruling on suppression of the Native American vote in North Dakota. You have the battle here for Amendment 4, which is quite amazing. Tomorrow night, I'll be in Melbourne with Desmond Meade, a returning citizen, and Howard Simon of the ACLU to talk about Amendment 4. We'll be at a big public forum. There is so much that's happening, not only this country, but in organizing around the world. And I just want to end by talking about the power of activism. You know, every day when you wake up, you will not know what will happen by the end of the day. It is a truly shocking time. But if you're engaged in social change, well, I think about Rosa Parks. You know, here was this remarkably brave woman who is fighting against and bringing to light the rape of African-American women, Reese Taylor, as you just said, in Alabama, bringing to light this. This was well before she sat down on that bus. But then on December 1st, 1955, she sits down on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and she launches the modern-day civil rights movement by refusing to get up for a white passenger. She's arrested. Joanna Robinson, her friend, if you young people may not know what this word is, mimeographs, hundreds of pages to begin the Montgomery bus boycott. Let's just say she tweeted. She tweeted these pamphlets that said they're going to launch the Montgomery bus boycott. 4 days later, I think it was December 5th, 1955, the Montgomery Improvement Association has its meeting as Rosa Parks is going to court to decide who will lead the bus boycott, and they decide that it will be a young minister who's just moved into town, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. King. When she died years ago, I was watching CNN, and it said, Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. And I thought, oh my God, they got this so wrong. Rosa Parks was a world-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing, right? The media denigrates activists. But what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? She was a seamstress, and she was tired. But she was also the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. He worked with A. Philip Randolph, the greatest organizer of the 20th century, who organized with Bayard Rustin, a black, gay pacifist, the 1963 March on Washington, where Reverend Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. E.D. Nixon worked with A. Philip Randolph to organize the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the thousands of African-American conductors on the trains, all called George. I mean, their mothers didn't name them George, but they were named for George Pullman by the passengers who owned the trains, which is why they needed to be organized, why they wanted to bring in an organizer to help them take on the company. E.D. Nixon, Rosa Parks, they've been working to challenge the racist laws of the South for years. She had gone to the Highlander Center, black and white together, strategizing about how to do this. When Pete Seeger, just before he died, he came into our studios and told the story of writing We Shall Overcome and doing it at the Highlander Center, and Dr. King walked in and he had Pete sing this song, We Shall Overcome. And Pete said the story went that Reverend King left him, got in the car, and said to the guy next to him, "That is a catchy tune." Right, what would be the anthem of the civil rights movement? Rosa Parks was an activist. She was a troublemaker. You never know when that moment will come, but if you are involved with social change, you will help to build a foundation that when it does come, you will help to determine the future. You will make history. And to show how brave Rosa Parks was, just a few months before, in the summer of 1955, that was the summer of Emmett Till. Emmett, a 14-year-old African-American boy, his mother, Mamie Till, wants him out of Chicago for the summer, so she sends him to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins in Money, Mississippi. He ends up being attacked by a white mob. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. He's dragged out of bed of his aunt and uncle's house, and he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up and sent in a casket back to Chicago to his grieving mother, Mamie, she said, "I want the casket open for the wake and the funeral." She said she wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands of people streamed by his casket and saw. And then Jet magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated head, and those images were published. Those of you who are older might well remember those Jet magazine pictures, and they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? In Afghanistan, yes, the war still rages there. The longest war in U.S. history. We saw the images of a baby dead on the ground. We saw that as a top picture in the surviving newspapers of our country when we learned her name and who her family was. If every radio and TV newscast for a week started with a story of a woman blown up in a wedding party in Yemen, and we learned why she was going to this party, who the bride and the bridegroom were, for just 1 week, we knew their names. If on everyone's Facebook wall, if every tweet referenced a soldier dead or dying for just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. And I just want to end back in World War II, where Pacifica Radio began. Democracy Now! Started in 1996, the only daily election show in public broadcasting. We now broadcast on over 1,400 public television and radio stations around the country and around the world. But this summer, Dennis and his wife and friends traveled to Germany, and they went to the gravestone of Hans and Sophie Scholl, and that's where I wanted to end. Back in World War II, Hans and Sophie Scholl were a German brother and sister. She went to the University of Munich. He was in medical school at the University of Munich. They weren't Jewish. They were German Christians. And they thought, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? They, together with their professor and other students and workers, formed the White Rose Collective. And they published a series of pamphlets so that the Germans would never be able to say they didn't know. And on one of those pamphlets were written the words, "We will not be silent." They distributed these pamphlets everywhere they could through Munich, and then they went beyond. They would drop them in schoolyards in the middle of the night in alleyways. They would get them out in marketplaces. But then Hans and Sophie and their professor were captured by the Gestapo. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.